Today we are interviewing Kathleen S. Martin, who is the law librarian at the Montgomery County Law Library in Maryland. Prior to that, Kate, as Kathleen prefers to be called, was consecutively the librarian for 4 Washington, D.C. law firms, including most recently McKenna, Long, and Aldridge. Kate, let's begin with a little personal history. Could you tell us where you were raised and about your life, both when you were young and today?
Well, I'm a California girl. I was born and raised in San Diego, California. I was the middle of 5 children. My father was an immigration inspector and my mother was a nurse. I think middle child are known to be very nurturing, and I think that's a good part of being my job, is really caring about the library, seeing as their own. I think I've used the expression, my library. I once had somebody who was here that was getting very noisy, and I came up to them and I said, "How dare you make this noise in my library?" Afterwards I thought, how could I say that? But I guess you feel that way about your libraries. You feel passionate about your libraries, you care. You have to put a lot into them. So anyway, I was born in San Diego, and I went to San Diego State University, and I was comparative literature major, which is completely not very practical, but I loved reading and I loved books, and I spent a year in Italy, my junior year abroad, and one of the things I did when I was there is I visited the Bernard Berenson Library. It was called I Tatti, and it was like this 15th century villa outside of Florence, and I remember thinking, librarians have the coolest jobs in the world. And I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be a librarian. So after having various jobs, including one as a customs inspector in Tijuana and LAX and various other jobs, I ended up at UCLA Library School. And I wanted to be a museum librarian or something interesting in historical bibliography. I even took a printing class from Andy Horn, this famous printing class, and it was great. I loved it. But when I graduated from library school, there was this thing called Proposition 13, and all the library jobs disappeared in California. And so I got an internship at the Smithsonian, and I worked in Washington. And I remember looking at the Washington Post and thinking, there are more jobs in this one Sunday paper than I'd seen in the previous 6 months in Los Angeles. I thought, this is a place to be. DC is library in heaven. There's more wonderful libraries here. There's the Folger, the Library of Congress, the National Library of Medicine. This is where it's happening. This is where I want to be. So I started looking at these jobs, and I found out that a lot of these jobs were in law libraries and in law firms. So the first one I interviewed with was Jim Sheelar, who I think is still at Arnold and Porter. And I interviewed with him. He had a cataloging job, and he said, "So, are you a cataloger?" And I had to say, no. He said, "You know, one of my really good friends, Vicki Ward, she is looking for an interlibrary loan person, and you should interview with her." So I interviewed with Vicki Ward, who is a giant of law librarians in Washington, D.C. She still is, I think, although she's not working anymore. She was a great person. Do you remember her?
Oh, yes.
Oh, Victoria Ward.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody.
In my early days, she was still quite active.
Oh, wow. There was a time where I could count, it took more fingers than my 2 hands to count the head librarians in Washington who worked for law firms who had worked for her. Everybody had worked for her. And I felt really fortunate to have worked under her and seen how she worked and how she organized her library. She was really significant in my development, Vicki Ward. So I worked for her, and then but I also wanted to work for the Library of Congress. So eventually I got a job there, and I started working there. It was the Library of Congress, Congressional Research Service, Congressional Reference Division, CRD of CRS, and I worked there, and I worked there for 2 or 3 years, and I worked under Catherine Jones, who was a significant, important librarian at the time, and then I got a job at a law firm, and I was their very first librarian, and it was, oh gosh, Ginsberg, Feldman, and Bress, And I worked there for several years, and I actually, when I was working for them, I started a group in Washington called First Firm Librarians. And it was a group of people that would meet once a month, and we were all our librarians first, all our firms' first librarians. And it got to be quite an interesting group because we all had these problems we all had to solve, and that was the first group I started. And that was one of my first things I did with local professional Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C. I've been very active in the chapter, and I've done almost every job. I've been editor, I've been president, I've been recording secretary, I've been committee chair, I've done nominations, I've even, and I say I've done every job, and I've invented jobs, I've created jobs, I've done cooperative projects, I did this big thing where I go, you know, we're going to have our 50th anniversary. So I decided I would have this whole festival, this celebration of turning 50. And this was in 1989. And we had a 3-day conference in a hotel. It was very wonderfully organized. Hopefully I had all kinds of people helping. There's such a wealth of talent in Washington. I had the best people, including Pat Kehoe. We had an exhibit hall. We had, one of the things that we had was we had a big luncheon. We had 500 or 600 people, and we had Sandra Day O'Connor speak. And I, because I was the chair of the event, I got to sit next to her, and it's one of the highlights of my life is that I got to have lunch sitting next to Sandra Day O'Connor, one of my personal heroes. So that was great. And soon after that, I did a bunch of things. I became, I think, had I been president by then? No, I became president after that of the chapter. And then after I did the chapter, I ran for national board, and I was on the national board. That was in the I guess in 1996, I got on the national board. And I was on till 1999. And one of the things I did was I co-chaired the meeting that was in Washington in '99. So that was a lot of fun. And I don't know, any more questions?
Well, I'm just entranced. I knew your history of being involved in sort of everything here in the local chapter. I knew about your background on the executive board of the AELL. But you were one of these people who always seemed to be there, and you must have been a president's dream in that you would be asked to do something, and if you'd said yes, it was done, and it was done very well. And,
right.
And these were not easy projects. I mean, I remember working with you, as you already mentioned, on that 50th anniversary thing, and you had to pull together a whole bunch of us, and a lot of little ends and pieces, and it wasn't without an occasional problem.
Oh yeah,
None of our dealings, but the hotel decided without telling us in advance they were going to renovate some of the space that we were supposed to be assigned to use, and so there were some problems there, but it was interesting. Now, you also mentioned sitting next to the Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. I was fortunate to sit at the same table and within an area where I could talk to her, and I had just recently reviewed a microfilm publication of the papers of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this was back in the 20s and so on, and I thought, you know, it struck me how formal the justices were at the time, and even referring to each other in notes between chambers. Very formal, always justice, and signed with the justice name and then the symbol for justice. And I asked her, you know, I figured, why not? I had access to a justice. I asked her, I mentioned that I'd done this, and I said I'd been struck by the formality. She said, are you people that way today? And she laughed and said, well, no, we're on a first name basis with each other, except we always call the chief the chief. So there was a little bit of, you know, old-fashioned formality, I guess, still there.
One of the things, this is just a tiny little thing, but I was sitting on one side and Carolyn Ahern was sitting on the other, and she was going to do the introduction, and she seemed so interested in us, and she said things like, well, you both are, you know, have children, and how do you do a full-time intense job like you have and still raise your, I mean, she was genuinely interested. And I thought, this person is, I was just amazed at how kind and concerned and caring she was. And this is a small little thing. A couple things is, we had 10 people sat at the round table, and we had an extra seat. And I said, I had invited my 9-year-old daughter, no, she was 8-year-old daughter, my daughter, to come and to take that extra seat, because I wanted somebody from my family to see something I've been working on for 2 years, unceasingly. And so she sat there and she came, and my daughter, and there was a thing in the middle, a vase of flowers. I could never really see her, so every once in a while I would kind of like move myself. I try to see, well, what's Elizabeth doing? And the justice said to me, she said, she's doing fine. I didn't even say anything. She said, she's doing fine. Don't worry about her. I thought, wow. She's so observant. She's so kind. And another thing that happened, this is really tiny, is that we had decorated the speaker's podium with, it was the fall, with this decoration thing. And someone said, oh, that's so beautiful. Did the hotel give you those decorations? And before I could even say, Sandra Day O'Connor said, no hotel would do anything that nice. Kate must have brought that. And I looked at her and I went, yes!
How did you guess?
How did you guess? I thought, not many people, I mean, and this is a justice, one of my heroines, would be that kind and observant and, I don't know, warm.
She was a very genuine person in all the right senses of the term. And of course, some of us think that she was a darn good justice, too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The pivotal justice for many years.
I'm sure there are people on the other side who would see it perhaps a bit differently, but certainly a kind and warm person. That they couldn't take issue with.
No, and her intellectual, some of her decisions and writing, on target, very reasoned, that was great. Which brings me up into why I think librarianship is so great is you get to meet all these wonderful people. That's been the greatest gift.
Well, Kate, you've been talking about many of the things you did here in Washington, but your reputation elsewhere is well established as somebody who has been a real shaker in the profession. And I say that in a positive fashion. The other day I was conducting another interview for this same oral history project, and the librarian, who was from a firm, found out that I was coming here, and indeed asked if you were going to be included, and I was delighted to say yes, you were being interviewed for the project. And then she started to just sort of gush on about all the things that you've done for primarily the firm librarians in other areas, so the work you've done here and the National Association. She mentioned the first firms thing. I don't know if she had once been here, I don't remember, but or if that has grown beyond Washington, or that concept. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the broader things you've done for the profession, especially for some of the librarians in like employment kind of situations that you were in?
Well, beyond Washington, I've done things, most recently, I had my presidential year as the, I guess it was the chairship of the Private Law Librarians National Association. And when I started as president, the president who was supposed to be going in had resigned, and so the vice president-elect has resigned. So I had to go in as president without having any vice presidential year. I had to, I'd never been on the board before. And that meeting was here in Washington. And I think that when I started, it was like, I think it was 2009, and maybe it was 2008, 2009, and that was a very low point. And I think something like 167 private law librarians only had gone to that Washington meeting, and usually there's 2 or 3 times as many go. And I had to call people up and try to get them to chair different committees and see if they were coming to the meeting. you know, get all this stuff together very quickly. And since I didn't have that year to work on it, and I just talked to people, and they just sounded so down and so, you know, like, oh, I don't know if I can come, and I'm not coming, and, you know, I'm going through all these terrible times, and I just felt really bad. And so I said, I'm going to do something. I thought, I have worked for 30 years. I've talked to people. I've spent all this time organizing things. I want to do something that really puts people back. Give them something back. And so I thought of the idea of having the summit. And to have a summit, which would have been the next year, which would have been Denver, and to invite people and to have very focused programming to PLL. So, because private law librarians always complain that they'd go to these programs and there'd be 2 academics, maybe a government person, and then a private, and then it really wouldn't be relevant. And I thought they needed something that was totally focused on what they were doing. And instead of being something negative like, oh, this is happening, and this bad thing is happening, and this library is closing, and, you know, all these terrible things that were happening at the time, I said, I want something positive. I want something really good that people are going to read about and go, I have to go there. I have to be there. And so we did, and the overall theme was change. Change is opportunity. You know, change is opportunity. Change is good. You know, change is not so bad. And so I had the idea, and so I called up people, because I'm very collaborative and I talk to people. So one of the first people I talked to was Mark S. And I said, what do you think if we do this? You know, he'd recently changed from the private to being a county library. And he said, that sounds like a good idea. And I said, we could have social media, we could have this, we could do it not just for then at the meeting, we could have a whole series of webinars that lead up. We could have a whole thing after where we keep talking about these issues. It could be a point of departure for all kinds of things. So I was really lucky because I talked to Carolyn Ahern and I got her involved, and I got some really superior people involved. Jonah Axelroth. You know, it's like whoever I called, I was so lucky. I'd call them and they say yes. And so we did these webinars, and you know, usually they have 30 people, 20, 30, 40 people. And we were doing the webinars in a series of 5 webinars, and we would have over 100 people. Mm. We would have over 100 people. People were so hungry to have this focused programming. And they said we would do it as like a Saturday, you know, all-day program, seminar, whatever. And usually they'd have 30 or 40 people. Well, we had over 100. We had over 100 people attending. And that was the first year, and it was so successful, we decided to do it a second year. And we had over 200 people coming. And I think they did it the third year, this past, and they had 300 people. I mean, they didn't even have 200 people at that meeting in Washington. And these are all private law firms, and we got the best of the best. And we got people, you know, we tried to focus it like, what do private law librarians really want to know about? And we said, they want to know what their senior partners, what their managing partners are thinking. We want to be able to go back with them and say, you're concerned about X. Here's how the library can help you. You're concerned about what? You know, you're supposed to follow the mission. You're supposed to show, this is the way we show our value. This is the way we, you know, do what we can, is by knowing what their concerns are. What's keeping them up at night? What are they thinking about? How can we help the relevancy? And I think, you know, like I said, it was very hard. It rejuvenated the PLL, which was kind of like, you know, like even the president, I didn't even, you know, I couldn't find people around.
She wasn't available, and you had to step in.
I had to step in, and other things too. And, you know, we have the talent. It was just bringing all these people together and having it work. And that was, you know, really, really satisfying.
Well, this sounds like it was not only a fascinating opportunity that you created for everybody, but something that was really needed. I mean, I've heard for years, and I'm sure everybody else has too, that so much of the programming in ALL tended to focus on the needs of other libraries, primarily the academics. and that many of the firm people for a number of years were going to SLA and to other organizations where the programming was a little more directed in their needs. But it sounds like you sort of brought all this together and under one big umbrella and have met a real need. And certainly, let's hope it continues.
Right.
It probably will. Yeah. One of the questions I occasionally ask in these interviews is for any predictions or thoughts on what's ahead for law librarians in general, and particularly librarians and firms, which was your area for a long time, or even courts, which is your current area of expertise.
Well,
do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things I think I've said a couple times is that I think it was in one of the current library publications, somebody was interviewed and she said elevator speeches, and maybe it was an SLA, but it was one of them, and she said, you know, what to say in an elevator speech, and what happens when your senior partner says to you, nobody goes into the libraries are dead, I never see anybody in the library, you know, all this negativity. And then the person said, well, the right reply is, what you say is, the library isn't books, the library isn't a building, the library is a collection of services. And our library is everywhere. Our library isn't just that building, that space. It's every time you turn on your computer and use Lexis or Westlaw. Anytime you're doing that, somebody had to negotiate that contract. Somebody had to get that on your desktop. All the services that we provide, all the research services, you know, people are becoming national, global, doing all these things.
I think it sounds like you think the future is rosy. We just have to go about acquainting those with whom we need to acquaint, the senior partners, the deans, and so on, with the fact that the library has been keeping up with the times and moving with the times and providing for the needs that have also changed with the times.
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, it's different. It's just a change. It's not the same. It's different.
Yeah. I want to thank you, Kate Martin, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and about our profession. Before closing, however, I always like to give the person being interviewed the last word, so to speak. Is there anything that you want to add at this point?
No, just how much I've enjoyed. I'm kind of at the end of my career.
Mm-hmm.
And how much I've enjoyed being a librarian. And the opportunities it's given me, both professionally and working in the work environment, but also all the association work. I think it's really created it's kind of like a balance between the two.
Mm-hmm.
It has made me, my association work has made me a better librarian in my work. It's given me opportunities to grow as a person, and I would recommend, I still recommend it. I've talked to librarians who said, I never would, I don't recommend it. I talked to somebody really bitter, and I think, no, it's still a wonderful profession. It's still really cool, it's still exciting, it's still romantic, it's still so many things. It's just a change. It's like anything else, it's just change.
Well, it was a wonderful ride for me in the years I was active, and though I'm now retired, I have fond memories, and I believe when you move into the retirement, you're going to have exactly the same kind of fond memories. Plenty of good ones.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you, Kate, for visiting with us this afternoon.
Okay.